Hi, Vincent Hall, and welcome to another episode of Anyone Can Draw, Paint, and Create. I thought today we'd try something a little bit different. Usually in the fall, we take some kind of art center field trip, and of course this year that's just not going to happen. But I wanted to try to find a way to get some new subject matter rather than constantly just looking for objects that you might have around the home or pictures from just looking at the internet from a computer or something like that. So we're going to take our imaginary field trip, if you will, to find fall objects. And you can use whatever source materials you would like. Could be calendars. Calendars are great for finding different ideas and things that you can do. I'm going to use a magazine that I got in the mail. I didn't even subscribe to, but I got it. I guess it was like a freebie because it's addressed to me, but it's Good Housekeeping, and it's their fall one with the pumpkins and things. So I thought I would do a fall still life, but we're going to do it as a collage. I found this card that I had bought, a generic greeting card, and it's all from cut shapes and objects. Now, we're not going to be doing something like that because that is collage in and of itself and not a drawing exercise. But you can create your own drawing scene from wherever you'd like it to be just by cutting out different pictures and creating one unified composition. So let's see how that might work. Well, I went through the magazine and I picked two different pictures. One from the cover, which is this pumpkin that I'm going to draw, but without the little bats, because no, I don't want to try to make it look too Halloween-y. I'm just looking at the pumpkin as a fall object. And then inside, they had this recipe about pears. And I really like the shapes of the shadows and the pears, and even the fact that one's cut off, because again, odd numbers of objects work better than even. So even though I might just have one pumpkin, I could always draw it a second time. The key is to plan this out on a blank piece of paper that I cut exactly the same size as the one I'm going to draw on. That way, you're basically comparing apples to apples, or in this case, pumpkins and pears to pumpkins and pears. So let's get started on the project. I have my paper and my object, so this probably seems pretty intuitive. We're simply going to cut the object out from its background area. And again, you know, if you just want to simply try to tear around it, if you don't have a scissors handy, that's fine too. And as a true left-hander, I am abysmal at cutting shapes, but we'll do the best we can here. And it doesn't have to be spot on perfect. We just want to try to get the rough idea. Then I'm going to do the same thing and cut the pears, although they're kind of interesting the way they are with this pinkish background, but we're just worrying about trying to create our own composition. So I'm going to treat each little pear here like its own shape, but I'm keeping the shadows, at least for now. I might decide later I don't want all those shadows, but I'm going to give myself a chance to make that decision later by cutting these things out and then placing them around. This is fun because you can do this with anything. Maybe you wanted to take a calendar per se. I've got some calendars here that, you know, you could certainly use at another time, but there's lots of nice backgrounds in calendars that you could add things to. For example, this one you could use as a background, maybe add birds in the sky, change the sky, cut out the blue, and then put in this sky. You know, you could change things around. Take things that you already have. I mean, this is kind of interesting in and of itself, but maybe there could be some objects in the foreground that aren't here now. Or this one where there's flowers in the foreground, but we could change it out and have a whole different background besides the sea. So look at calendars, look at magazines for this project. Look at your old photos. You could even just cut some things out if you printed them on regular printing paper, not fancy photo paper, and just cut those out and create your own montage or scene. Might be from places you've lived before, or could be family treasures or trips or things like that, whatever most interests you as far as creating your own composition using cutout objects as your inspiration. All right, so I have my piece of a pear and my pumpkin. So now I just need to decide how I want to arrange these. so that they might make sense. And since these pears were lying down, and I do want to keep their shadows going the same way for the light source, I might plan this out. The fun is to put things partly maybe over top of each other. Maybe, I don't know if I'm going to use this little piece of a pear or not. I don't think I am. And then that way I can just have 3 objects. So I'm just going to plan these where I want them. This looks pretty good to me. To keep things from moving around, you can use tape. Now I'm just going to roughly tape these down on the surface. You could do the old donut tape and roll it up and tape it in the back. But I just need to hold these down so that when I start drawing it, they don't go crazy and move around. But this is going to be what we're going to start with. And then we're going to create our own composition on the same size piece of paper. This way it's easier to do your proportions. And I decided to go back to color pencil using those Inktense pencils that I liked from a few months ago when we were in our first time here doing the drawing lessons online, and give it a little oomph that way. So here's what we want to draw. Here's where we're going to draw it. And this way it looks like we could have set up an actual still life of our own. I'm going to go with just a neutral color pencil. In this case, I'm going to select a brown. You could use regular graphite pencil or whatever you might want. And I'm just going to roughly draw exactly where I see everything. And again, if you're one of those people that like plot points, you know, figure it out based on what you're seeing. But I'm going to just, for this time, try to rough it in a little more freehand. And pumpkins come in a variety of shapes. So if you are doing something thematic for the fall, like a pumpkin, no worries if it's a little rounder or less round, because pumpkins have all different shapes. Each one is unique. Then the key is to notice where my stem is on the pear, which is right here, a little off the pumpkin, and then the pear shape around here. You might even have plastic or silk flowers or fruits or vegetables or things like that lying around for maybe a decorative display for the holidays. So you're welcome to use that too. If you don't want to do a cutout drawing, maybe you have enough on your own. There's a little pumpkin. So here I'm going to just take my eraser when I get there and just make this a little bit further away because I overshot the runway with that drawing. But we have our basic outline. Now it's time to fill in the colors and see what we can do about unifying this with some shadows. I selected my colored pencils, and I always like to get the ones I want to use out, although it looks like I took about half of the set out because there's a lot of different colors here. And the basic idea, if you're doing any kind of a squash, gourd, or pumpkin or fall-like vegetable, is look at what they do as far as any kind of shape segments. We all know pumpkins have ridges. So if you draw the ridge by starting with the one closest to the outside shape here, and just kind of trace that one around again, and then just make them a little less obvious as they get closer. It's almost like segments of an orange. So the one on the left is going to mirror your left outline. The one on the right is going to mirror your right outline. And then they just get more narrower. And the one in the middle is usually almost a straight line. That way you're sure to have the basic shape as we get started drawing this. And then I'm just going to rough in the color. Because again, these are my water-soluble drawing pencils. So I am doing a drawing, but I'm doing it in water. And I'm doing this lightly, just the whole thing, just to get that volume of the pumpkin. And I was thinking about this. If you really aren't into doing still lifes, but you like to do animals or people, you could create your own imaginary world of different animals in a scene together. I was thinking of the Peaceable Kingdom, where we have elephants and tigers and lambs and all kinds of animals, even reptiles lying down together. That would work perfectly for something like this. You know, you could do maybe an homage to family pets or whatever you might want to do. Then my pears are more of a limey green. So the pear doesn't have segments, but it does have a fatter bump here. So what I'm going to do is, this is something different, do my shading in a circle and just keep coming closer and closer to the center so that I have my area where I'm going to have this little light highlight already planned in. And I used a brown colored pencil for the outline because there's a lot of brown in these pears too, especially the ones that I have that I forget that I bought and they turn pretty brown pretty quickly in real life. So we've roughed in our basic colors. Not much going on here as far as a full drawing, but we have our colors. Now we can go back in and get some detail. So for the pumpkin, here it's really light. I'm going to leave that alone right now. I'm going where I see my darker areas and just taking a reddish color because this is almost like a red-orange pumpkin. If it's a brighter pumpkin, you could do a lighter orange or go over it with yellow to brighten it up a bit. It just depends on what you're looking at. And again, I'm ignoring these bats. So I'm not going to draw shadows where I see the bats. I'm just trying to draw some shadows where I see darker areas of this orange kind of coming up in here a little bit. This is also a drawing project that won't take a ton of your time. So if you want to try something easy and fast, this is a fun way to go. Once you get things cut out, it's pretty simple. Now where it's white, since I'm drawing on gray paper so you could see the colors better, I'm going to take my white colored pencil and just kind of lay in my highlights. And remember, we can draw over this after we use water. And if you're not using water, that's fine too, because I think it's nice sometimes to just have the pencil line. Painting professor messages that I use all the time, they were like, draw a drawing, paint a painting, and take a photograph of a photograph. And the three shouldn't look the same. But sometimes those rules do not apply, and it depends on what your personal aesthetic is to what you like to do. All right. So we just kind of blocked in the highlights. I'm going to go back over this again now with the orange because it might need a little more pop. Just trying to get some of these tones because when I do use the water, I don't want to have a lot of paper showing through. But that's roughly it for the pumpkin. Okay, now the pear, we did that circular thing, and we're going to do the same thing where we see a brownish shadow right here. So I'm just kind of roughing this in. Got a pretty fat pear here. And then just going down, just talking to myself and saying, oh, I see a shadow here, then I see green, then I see a shadow again. So I'm just roughing this in. So you can draw, and you can change your light source if you want. You know, it's completely up to you. Just trying to get the basics in. This pear, actually, it's interesting. This pear does not, it was not with the pumpkin, but if you can see here, it's reflecting some orange, which is perfect because if in real life I had this pear next to this pumpkin, it would be reflecting the orange around it. So it kind of was serendipitous, but it worked out. There's a lot of shadow here. So I'm just kind of roughing in my shadows. And then where I see this orange, even though it's not an orange pear, the pear has some reflective qualities. I'm going to add some orange in here too. This is going to help unify your picture a bit and give it a little more weight, so to speak. Okay, and then I just want to make sure I have my pear over my pumpkin and not the other way around. So I'm going to brighten this up a bit. Now the shadows here are not black or gray. They're kind of a mauvey color, but we can interpret this to be laying wherever it is. This happened to be on a peach colored background. So I think I'm just going to go with the black for the shadow, but just do it lightly. And I'm just following around where I see the shadow on this pear. And you can see I'm holding my pencil very close to being parallel to the paper again, which is what we want to do when we do long cast shadows. And just kind of coming around here. And my guess is this pumpkin's also going to have a shadow because it was on a black background, but we won't see most of that because it goes behind the pear, but maybe just a little bit back in here and then definitely under the pumpkin. There we go. Okay, so now we've laid in our shadows. The only thing left to do are the stems. If you're doing some kind of a growth with the stem, always look at what you see. Stems are a lot more rigid than you think. And I'm roughing it in with a basic green, but I'm leaving some areas blank. The pear stems are brown. So if you want to keep it true to color, then leave the pear stems be brown. Now I'm taking a kind of a brownish green over that bright green and going in where I see the darker colors. And there's teeny little bits of green that kind of come out where these segments pop through on the pumpkin. And I might also bring in a little bit of that green just because green is almost the same as a blue. It's a high, blue makes green, blue and yellow. So we can use it to just define those segments a little bit more. Then where I see a light green, I could use white or this light yellow. I think I'll use both. And then I'm going to go back in with my white to really get where I see these highlights on this stem of this pumpkin. And then maybe even add a little bit of brown to further emphasize the areas of the stem that don't have so much highlight. Then I'm also going to make my pear stems a little more pronounced. This one doesn't have a stem, but I wanted to add one, so I did. And that's the beauty of art, because you can make everything your own. Now I'm just gonna give this pear a little more color so when we go over it with water, we'll see the difference. But if you wanted to stop here in the drawing, you probably could. It's pretty high key, which we talked about last time. There's not a lot of depth. That's why I wanted to add the water so that you'll get a chance to see this a little smoother and in depth. But the idea is still basically creating your own composition using cutout pictures. Any little paintbrush you happen to have lying around at home will work just fine. And again, almost any colored pencil will work as water soluble. We even tried that with the barrels, so that was fun. And you could even wet graphite and make a nice smooth area. So if all you have is a pencil and a brush, that's fine. But what if you don't have a brush? Use a Q-tip. Use a cotton ball, a piece of paper towel, or a tissue just wetted down will work just fine. But again, I'm using a brush because I have one here. And this is not a fancy brush. This actually came out of a little craft set that I bought for my grandkids for when they come to visit. So it's a pretty basic brush. I think a pack of 3 was like $1.10 at the dollar store. So by all means, do not have to go too fancy with these. But as you can see here, it makes a world of difference in the drawing. And yes, this is still a drawing, even though it appears to be more painterly now that we're adding water. What we're really just doing is finding a way to blend the medium that we're using. And you don't have to blend all of it. Like maybe you decide you want to leave the stem more with the colored pencil and not so much water, which is what I did there. I just did a little bit of it. And then going around the pear, wetting this down. And again, yes, your paper is going to bump a little bit, but that's okay because we are going to put this under a book or something if it does that, and just give it some weight until it dries, and then it'll be really just fine. Then the last thing I'm going to do are these shadows, because if you don't do anything else, probably softening your shadows down. And boy, when that black takes off, it takes off. It didn't take much of the black pigment to get my shadow here. So if you notice what I just did there, I was doing that same technique that we did last week, which was the directional line to show the negative space or to show the shadows, because I had to try to go around this little pear as close as I can. And again, I'm not painting so much. I mean, I'm moving a brush around, but I'm treating the brush like a vehicle for a drawing. And this shadow here would be lighter, and I'm just kind of trying to blend this in a little bit. Well, maybe it'll go all the way over to the pear. We'll decide how that works. Yeah, that's okay. Then just kind of fading it out. It just gives it some grounding so that it doesn't look like these things are just kind of hanging out without anywhere to be. So I'm just cleaning off my brush basically with ever so little bit of tone. So it looks like maybe these are on a little table or some kind of a surface so that my still life doesn't look completely groundless. Then using what's left on my brush to just add a little bit of shadow subtly in this pear and kind of blur in my lines on the shadow a little bit. It dries pretty quickly, so as soon as we've done this, we're ready to go back in. If I wanted to introduce a little more brown here, I can go over it and just leave the lines this time instead of trying to fade everything in. I think it's nice to leave some things look like a drawing, since this is a drawing, and go over it, but not shade in all these lines. So I'm just kind of doing what's called gestural line shading. It's just really rough. And it also is a good way to emphasize the distance between these two shapes here. So I can do a couple little outlines around my pear, make it look more drawn again, a little looser. Go back into my pumpkin. Again, I'm using brown, just to keep it more in line with what I would like. And then my favorite, this white pencil for the highlights. And I'm not gonna re-wet it once I do this, but I can go back over these areas that I have and get some of the light highlights that I see on the pumpkin back in so that my light source makes more sense. Same thing with the pear. Adding my little highlights. It's really key to put your highlights back wherever you see them. And most fruits will have a little bit of a sheen, so they're gonna have a bit of a highlight somewhere. You just have to figure out where that highlight is as you're doing the drawing. And I like this. Again, these light pencils kind of correct a multitude of issues, what you're dealing with, highlights and shadows, or things that just might have gone a little too dark for you. Even this little stem has a little highlight in it. Go back and add a little more to the pumpkin, a little more to this, kind of come down. And then we just talk to ourselves. Where do we see some highlights? I see more right here. So I'm just gonna add those in again. I see that next to some of these darker areas, there's lighter highlights, and that will really give your drawing some pop. So double check where your highlights and your shadows are, and don't be afraid to do what you see here. Where there's a dark line, there's a light highlight next to it. That dark line is usually a ridge, so if you have a highlight near it, and maybe the highlight doesn't go the whole way like this one, it kind of tapers off. And then maybe here where it's really light, we can go back in and just add a little bit of a shadow here and there where we might need to add a little more definition to the pumpkin if it got faded out. But I think that's pretty much it. This was a pretty quick, easy peasy drawing lesson. It's fun for the fall. There we go. So hopefully you can see my original and now my drawn object with this. Now, once I looked at my picture, one of the things I noticed is the pears stand out pretty nicely, but this looks really flat in here. When I look at my pumpkin, sorry about the glare, I see that there's not a lot of shadow because originally it did not have pears in front of it. If you want to correct a shadow, which I'm going to do here real quickly before we wrap it up, what I'm going to do is find my complementary color and do a little bit of shading right in here. Since my pumpkin is orange, I'm using a blue pencil. So here's my blue pencil, and I'm just going over the edge of the pumpkin to try to define the shadow around this pear a little bit more, because that pear would cast a bit of a shadow onto the pumpkin, and maybe right here a little bit too. Then the key, as always, if you're doing that shadow in the complement, go back over it with the original color to try to blend it in a bit. Otherwise, it just might stand out too much as blue and not as much as the shadow of the color we were using. Okay, I'm going to counter that now that I see it. There's always more to do. That's the beauty of art, by getting this pumpkin a little brighter just to really make it stand out against the area. And again, I'm not re-blending this in. I'm just giving it a little more pop. And this little guy too, just to help those little pears stand out. There we go. So here's my finished still life. I'm pretty happy with it. I like the shadows and the highlights. It's a nice fall kind of still life, inspired by this, which we changed around a little bit. So the idea with this project, the drawing project, is to make it your own. And the fun part is, all it takes is a pair of scissors, maybe some tape if you want to keep everything nice and neat, and just 2 sheets of paper. You could use computer paper, whatever you might have around the house. Speaking of paper, maybe you have wrapping paper that you could use as a background and glue things on top. Sometimes we have some interesting stripes or patterns on wrapping paper, or maybe just a really nice color, a solid color. So whatever you want to glue your objects on, go for it. And like I said, maybe you have a large calendar picture or an old print of a photo that you want to add things to it. That works too. I'll be interested to hear what people think of for this project and see some of the results with the drawing folks down in the Art Center. But if you're not down in the Art Center, feel free to try this and maybe just stop by and show me what you've done. It's a fun project, and it's an easy way for you to come up with a composition and play around with shapes without committing. You can always move things around until the tape goes down. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode of Anyone Can Draw, Paint, and Create. I have some samples of collage-inspired drawings that follow. And till I see you next week, Vincent Hall, stay safe and be well.